The peaceful lake. I thought I'd found peace by the lake, a quiet escape after years of saving for my dream home. The kind of place where mornings were calm, the air was clean, and the only sound was the soft splash of water against the shore. For a while, it felt perfect, until the HOA decided even peace was something they needed to control. It started small: letters, warnings, talk about community harmony. Then one morning, I walked to the water and froze. The lake, my lake, was clouded, lifeless, and coated in a thin film of chemicals. Dead fish floated at the surface, the smell of poison heavy in the air. The HOA claimed it was routine maintenance, but as I dug deeper, I realized something horrifying. They hadn't just poisoned my lake. They'd poisoned their only source of water. How far would you go to protect what's yours? The Orange Notice. When I first moved into the Lakeside Reserve community, it felt like the culmination of everything I'd worked for. The neighborhood was clean, manicured, picture-perfect. Houses lined up like teeth in a smile. Every lawn trimmed to regulation height. Every mailbox painted the same color. It was orderly, almost too orderly. But I told myself that was the price of peace. The lake behind my house was the reason I bought the property. It wasn't big, but it was quiet. I'd walk down each morning with my coffee, cast a line, and let the world fade into the rhythm of the water. It wasn't about fishing, really. It was about silence, space, and the feeling of owning something truly mine. The neighbors were polite, distant, predictable. The retired couple next door who trimmed their hedges every Saturday, the young family who waved from their porch but never lingered. It was all smiles and small talk, like everyone was performing calmness for the sake of the HOA. And the HOA, they were the unspoken law of the land. Maintaining community standards was their favorite phrase. If your trash cans weren't pulled in by 10:01 a.m., you'd get a warning. Paint your fence a slightly off-white color, and you'd get a letter. The rules were endless, but I told myself, stay quiet, stay respectful, stay invisible, and you'll be fine. For months, I was. Then one day, I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Violation of community regulation. 12B, unauthorized use of shared property. Shared property? The lake was listed on my deed. When I called, the HOA president, Martha Reynolds, answered. Her voice was tight, clipped, the kind of voice used by people who never get questioned. She told me the HOA had updated the bylaws. The lake, apparently, was now a protected communal resource. No fishing, no swimming, no exceptions. The HOA president's warning. When I tried to explain that I wasn't disturbing anything, she cut me off. Rules are rules, she said, then hung up. That's how it started. The orange notice became the first in a stack of paper I'd come to know too well. The fines followed, then the inspections, then the whispers. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. They were targeting me. And I had no idea how far they'd go to make sure I stopped fighting back. Surveillance in the neighborhood. The first fine was for unauthorized activity near protected water. $150. Then came improper equipment storage, my fishing pole leaning against the shed. Then, failure to maintain landscaping standards, one weed in the driveway. I started documenting everything: photos, timestamps, letters. I thought if I stayed logical, I could prove their harassment. But logic doesn't work against people obsessed with control. Soon, I noticed strangers in reflective vests walking around my property. They called themselves compliance officers, sent by the HOA. They measured things, photographed my yard, whispered among themselves. When I asked for their purpose, they smiled and said, "Routine inspection." The next day, another notice. Unauthorized perimeter modification. My crime? Decorative rocks that had been there since the day I moved in, the midnight poisoning. Weeks passed. My neighbors stopped waving. Conversations died mid-sentence when I walked by. I'd become the HOA's cautionary tale, the man who broke the rules. Then one night, just after midnight, I saw two figures near the lake. Flashlights, gloves. They were pouring something into the water from large containers. I took photos, zoomed in, my heart racing. The next morning, I learned what they'd done. The dead lake. The lake was dead. The surface had turned opaque, coated with a metallic film. Fish floated belly up. The reeds along the edge were curling brown. The stench was unbearable, a mix of decay and chemicals. The HOA posted signs within hours. Algae treatment in progress. Do not disturb. Martha arrived soon after, clipboard in hand, pretending everything was under control. She even smiled at me and said, "Environmental health is our top priority." But I knew the truth. I'd seen her face in one of the photos. Martha herself was one of the people dumping the chemicals. The retaliation. I contacted the county's environmental department, filed a formal complaint, and sent them everything: photos, dates, witness statements from a few brave neighbors. But before the county could act, the HOA retaliated. Rumors spread that I was the one who contaminated the lake. Flyers appeared in mailboxes claiming I'd been using fertilizer runoff and endangering wildlife. I woke one morning to find my mailbox smashed. Another day, someone poured paint on my driveway. Still, I didn't stop. I gathered evidence, waited for the county's results. The leak of truth. Weeks later, they came. High levels of copper sulfate, nitrates, industrial-grade contaminants. Environmental negligence, the report called it. They couldn't name the party yet, but I knew. And then I remembered something Martha had once bragged about, that the community's irrigation system drew water straight from the lake. They hadn't just poisoned me. They'd poisoned themselves. That night, I sent copies of everything: the chemical report, the photos, my correspondence, to every homeowner, every board member, and the local news station. By morning, the neighborhood wasn't silent anymore. It buzzed with fear and outrage. Lawns were dying. The sprinklers ran brown. And for once, no one was looking at me with judgment. They were looking at the HOA. The truth had finally surfaced. The HOA meeting erupts. The HOA called an emergency meeting. Mandatory attendance. The community center filled fast. Neighbors whispering, holding copies of the reports I'd sent. Then Martha walked in, still clinging to her authority, her smile stretched thin. She began her speech, claiming misinformation was spreading. But before she could finish, a landscaper stood up. His voice shook with anger. "My client's lawns are dead. You told us it was safe." The room exploded. People shouted, waved papers, demanded answers. Someone read aloud the report naming the contaminants. Another asked about the maintenance contracts, all tied to Martha's husband's company. The moment of exposure. And then I stood up. If anyone still doubts, I said, holding up a folder, here's the proof. I handed it to the crowd. The photos, Martha, under flashlight, pouring chemicals. Gasps rippled through the room. Martha froze. Those photos are out of context, she said, voice trembling. Approved by who? Someone yelled. Your husband? It was over. The crowd's fury reached a fever pitch. Board members resigned on the spot. A younger member motioned to suspend all HOA authority pending investigation. Moments later, a county environmental officer walked in. Calm, official, holding a clipboard. We've completed the trace, he said. The contamination originated from chemicals purchased by a vendor registered to Martha Reynolds, HOA president. The silence was deafening. Martha's face went pale. She tried to speak, but couldn't. As the officer read out the charges, fraud, negligence, misuse of community funds, she turned and fled the room, past the people she'd ruled through fear. The HOA's reign ended right there. But I knew the story wasn't finished. Because justice on paper doesn't heal poisoned water. The lake restored. The weeks that followed felt strange, quiet, but not the kind of quiet I used to love. This one was fragile, uncertain. The HOA was suspended, the bank accounts frozen, and for the first time in years, people were free to breathe. Without constant inspections or letters, neighbors began acting human again. They spoke freely, helped each other, shared stories of fines and humiliation. A community built on fear was finally learning what it meant to live without it. The county's investigation confirmed everything: misused funds, falsified invoices, environmental crimes. The news ran the story, and suddenly, Lakeside Reserve wasn't just a quiet suburb anymore. It was a headline. Martha and her husband faced charges. Their home went up for sale, empty and lifeless. The same neighbors who once admired her order now couldn't stand to say her name. But justice wasn't just in her downfall. It was in what came next. We formed a new committee. No president, no hierarchy, just residents, real people, deciding together how to rebuild. I didn't want a title. I'd had enough of authority. Instead, I helped where it mattered, replanting trees, cleaning debris, helping test irrigation lines. The lake began to recover. The water cleared. Birds returned. Fish were reintroduced. Every morning, I'd stand by the shoreline and feel something I hadn't in months: hope. By summer, the community held a small gathering. Not an HOA event, just neighbors sharing food and laughter. Children ran near the water. No one needed permission to enjoy their home. Peace reclaimed. I still keep the old notices. The fines, the warnings, the threats. Not as trophies, but reminders. A lesson about what happens when control replaces compassion. Because peace isn't found in order. It's found in respect, and the courage to stand up when something's wrong. Sometimes, the only way to clean poisoned water is to let the truth rise to the surface. Now, when I cast my line into the lake, I don't just fish. I reflect. On the silence, the struggle, the cost of standing up. And I realize peace was never something the HOA could give me. It was something I had to fight to reclaim. The lake reflects the sky again now, and every ripple reminds me of one thing. When power poisons peace, truth becomes the only thing that can cleanse it. What would you have done if your HOA poisoned your lake just to control you? Would you fight back or walk away?